we also have our fragrance garden, our garden for the blind in this little building. Coming up on the left, they have flowers and plants in there that give off different scents. That's our fragrance garden for the blind. Also, if you're thinking of moving to downtown Savannah, you'd like a nice house to live in, might take a look at the Chestnut House, this brown building on the corner here is for sale. It's from 1897. It's a steal of just $2.2 million. So keep the Chestnut House in mind. Well, there's a lot of really interesting architecture in this part of Savannah. Over here on this corner is another really nice building. They just started restoring that one. There's a lot of interesting buildings in this part of Savannah. That's Savannah starting behind us. The oldest part of the city is by the river. We'll go down the River Street towards the end of the tour. And then the further south you go, the newer things get. This is the Victorian district. We're going into what is today the Starland district up here a little bit. And these are really the last two expansions of Savannah before you get the really modern suburbs and shopping malls and all of that on the south side of town. And up around this corner, we'll see our American Legion Mall. It was built in 1913. The American Legion up here was the birthplace of the 98th Air Force. 98th Air Force started right around here in January 1942 during World War II. Started right over here with just 7 men. Would become the most powerful air armada the world had ever seen. They could send up over 2,000 bombers along with 1,000 fighters on a single mission before they were done, and it started right in this building here. We also have the National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force. It's right outside Savannah to the west of us, and they have some interesting things in there, including the fully restored B-17 Flying Fortress. City of Savannah's on display in there, one of only about 40 B-17s still in existence. This is Bull Street we're on, named for Colonel William Bull of South Carolina. The thing about Bull Street, it divides Savannah into east and west. Everything over here to the right is west something or other. Everything on this side is east something or other. And Bull Street's the dividing line. That really seems to confuse people for some reason. So keep that in mind as you're wandering around Savannah. Bull Street divides as the center of downtown, you might say. Also, a lot of churches on Bull Street. Over here to the right is St. Paul's Greek Orthodox Church. That congregation started around 1900. We have a fairly good-sized Greek community here in Savannah. One of the events that takes place in Foresight Park every year is our Greek Food Festival. Although they had to cancel that this year, along with a lot of other things. But that's the center of the Greek Orthodox community here, you might say. But in the 1880s and 90s, wasn't a whole lot in this area. The city of Savannah wanted to expand. They started extending the streetcar lines into this area. It took a while. Really wasn't until the 1920s this area really started growing. And it grew and grew until World War II. After World War II, when they really started building the modern sections and on the south side, the modern suburbs and shopping malls and all of that. And a lot of things started moving out that way. This area began to decline. And by the 1960s, 70s, there were a lot of vacant, abandoned buildings in this area. And in the early 1990s, a couple of graduates from Scala, the Savannah College of Art and Design, saw an opportunity. They bought the old Starland Gary we'll see up here in a minute. It had sat vacant for a number of years. They bought the building, started restoring it, got some other people and businesses involved, and that was really the beginning of the restoration of this area. And they restored somewhere around 200 buildings all around this central middle section of Savannah here. Including this one. This is a really nice Art Deco building they restored about a year or so ago. Today it's the Big Bon Bodega. Got wood-fired bagels. I'm not really sure what those are. I'm going to go and check that out. Well, that's a really nice Art Deco building. There's not a lot of really nice Victorian-style houses in this section. A lot of different styles of architecture in this part of Savannah. But coming up ahead, this area ahead of us is called the Starland District because of the Starland Gary, where the restoration movement began. And Starland Gary started in the early 1900s. A bunch of dairy farmers in Pula, they got together, started a company, and it grew and grew, got to be a pretty good size operation. A good while there. They were delivering milk, dairy products throughout this neighborhood, and using horse-drawn wagons until almost 1960. But the business grew and grew, and in 1932, they built the Starland Bakery. See up here in just a second, and it was took up the whole block. The building's been broken into smaller businesses today. This is the beginning of the restoration of this neighborhood, so it's going to be known as the Starland District. Well, this whole block up here on the right was the Starland Gary. It's broken into smaller businesses today. You have the Back in the Day Bakery here on the corner. They're worth a visit while you're here. They've been nationally recognized for a number of things over the years. All this was the Starland Dairy. Next to it here is the Starland Yard. And right here on this corner, on the left here is one of our shuttle stops. If you'd like to come back and visit this area, that's one of the spots we can drop you off or pick you up. City of Savannah is kind of particular about that. You have to be at one of the official stops for us to pick you up or drop you off. And the Starland Yard there is one of two in Savannah. And the Starland Yard's interesting little place. They have a number of little restaurants in there. They often do live music on the weekends. And they're already open. Usually they don't open up until the evening. But this whole area has kind of become more of an eclectic neighborhood. A lot of local artists, they live and work in this area. This is the other side of the Starland Dairy. It was a big operation, but as this neighborhood declined, as supermarkets became more prominent, their business declined. Eventually they went out of business around 1985, but it took up this whole block at one time. Over to the right, that big yellow building over there is the Starland Cafe. That's another good place to eat, good place for lunch. And there's some more modern elements in this part of Savannah. We have Popeye's Chicken over there to the right. Also down there to the right, that stoplight is Victory Drive. That's really where the modern section of Savannah starts. Now, they've repurposed quite a few buildings around this area. Up here on the right was Savannah's first supermarket. This was David's Supermarket, opened up here in 1936. They were there through the 1990s. I'm not sure what they're putting in there today, but that was Savannah's first supermarket, right? But despite everything that's been going on, the shutdown in the last few months, there's a lot going on in this part of Savannah. They're doing a lot of restoration work, some new businesses, but they repurposed quite a few buildings. This green building on the right here was a bank for years and years. That was my grandmother's bank. For a long time, it's been turned into a really good place to eat. That's the wall today. And there are a number of really good restaurants in this part of Savannah. Down 37th Street, just a couple of blocks, is Scala, a really good Italian place. It's in a huge building. It was a convent for a number of years, and we still have the old chapel upstairs on the second floor. But that's La Scala. Check them out if you like Italian food. They're just down right around the corner here. But up ahead we have our public library on the right. Coming up on the left is one of Savannah's more well-known buildings. We have the Gingerbread House up here, built in 1899 by a German family. They built it in the gingerbread style of architecture that was popular in Germany at the time. This yellow building to the left here is the Gingerbread House, and you can find it on postcards and book covers. One of the most photographed buildings in the city of Savannah. And we also have SCAD here. This great big brick building to the right, part of the Savannah College of Art and Design. You'll see them all over. They own about 7 buildings all over the city of Savannah today. And next to it here is the blue door. On this corner is our other shuttle stop. I'll come back and visit this area. That's the other stop. We can drop you off or pick you up. That's a great look at the Victorian District and Starland District. The rest of the tour will be back up here in the Historic District. James Silverport, he had a specific plan for the city. Also had a specific plan for each of the wards or neighborhoods. He put the square in the middle of things. On the east and the west side of each square, he put big lots. They're called these trust lots. These originally were for public buildings, banks, churches, courthouses. Along the north and south side of each square, he put small lots. There were 10 in each group. And the tithing lots were for people's houses. Now the squares are really nice parks today, but they started out as work areas. They kept animals there, they had wells, bake ovens. Really wasn't until much later the squares became the nice parks we have today. And they were square at one time. They rounded off the corners in the early 20th century for traffic to get around. But they were square originally. Over here on this corner is another old bank they turned into a restaurant. This is the local 1110 on this corner. We still have the old night deposit and drop box there on the corner. So that's another good place to eat. And then up ahead here, we're back to Foresight Park. Also ahead of us here is the hiker, as this statue's going to be known. This statue is our monument to the Spanish-American War veterans from Georgia. Depicts an actual Spanish-American war veteran. The guy you see up there, his name was Leonard Silkman. He was from Allentown, Pennsylvania. He was the model for that statue. And they put that up in 1931 to honor the Spanish-American war veterans from Georgia. Apparently there's a couple more scattered throughout the United States. One they tell me is in Arlington National Cemetery. Up ahead you'll see the old Telfair Hospital. It opened up in 1886. It was a hospital for women and children only originally. Later it would be, or they would open the Georgia's first nursing school. It's here on the corner of this, on the right here. building's a retirement home. Telfair Hospital merged with Canberra Hospital in 1960. There's still some modern incarnations living on the south side of town. But this is the old Telfair Hospital, a retirement home today. The Telfair family was a very prominent family in the early days of Georgia. Edward Telfair came here from Scotland in the 1700s. Made a ton of money in the import-export business. And we'll see the Telfair Mansion over on Telfair Square. Towards the end of the tour, it was built by his son, Alexander Telfair. He built the building in 1818 for his mother and sisters to live in. But Mary Telfair, the last of the Telfair family, after Mary didn't have children, left the building to the Georgia Historical Society, and they opened the building up as the Telfair Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1886. It's the oldest museum in the South, and we'll see that towards the end of the tour. Next is on the left here is Foresight Park. Up on the right, up ahead here, we'll see the mansion on Foresight. It's a really nice hotel today. It actually kind of has two parts to it. There's a much older building and much newer section. This is the building, it's a brick building on the corner. It's the mansion on Foresight. And this side over here is the newer section. They built all of this in the early 2000s, and it was added on to an older building we'll see on the other side that was built back in the 1880s. And this whole thing here today is the mansion on Foresight, one of our 4 diamond hotels. But the original building was built back in 1888. It was a family home originally. Later on, it became part of a hotel, but in between there, for a good while, it was a funeral parlor. It was the Fox Weeks funeral home for years and years. In fact, there's several really nice places to stay in downtown Savannah that at one time were funeral parlors. If you check into the Pico House over there on Chippewa Square, they will let you spend the night in the old embalming room. And they'll serve you breakfast in what they still refer to as the beauty. So around the corner up here is the original mansion. They've got 700 draping in there today. Really nice hotel, or restaurant for the hotel. And an art gallery, some event space. So this is the original mansion. And then across the street on this corner on the right here is our Foresight Park stop. If you'd like to come back and visit Foresight Park, this is stop number 4 along the route. Now, throughout the course of the year, there's a lot of things that go on here in Foresight Park. Across from us is the amphitheater. They do a lot of concerts in there. The Jazz and Blues Festivals do concerts there. The Symphony does their picnic in the park. Every May you can come to the Doggy Carnival here in Foresight Park. We're a very dog-friendly city here in Savannah. Also, there's Collins Quarters opened a little coffee shop, cafe type place right across from us. You can get some lunch, something to eat there. And the beginning of March, over here, you can watch the greening of the fountain ceremony, as it's called. sort of the start of our St. Patrick's celebration. So you're over here where the big fountain is. They turn all the fountains green in downtown Savannah for St. Patrick's Day. It starts with a big ceremony on the north side of Foresight Park. People don't believe St. Patrick's Day is about a month long here in Savannah. We have the Irish Festival at the end of February, and there's events and ceremonies, a lot of things go on for about 3 weeks leading up to St. Patrick's Day. And normally we have one of the biggest parades on the planet. Cancel all of that this year. But normally they hold a mass in the cathedral first thing in the morning on St. Patrick's Day. Start the parade right out front on Abercorn Street, and it goes usually about the next 4 or 5 hours. We have one of the biggest parades on the planet here every St. Patrick's Day. So coming up here is Calhoun Square, named for John C. Calhoun, two-time Vice President of the United States. And also coming up on the right up here is the Massey School, Georgia's first public school. They opened the Massey School up in 1856, and it functioned as a school until 1974. This pink building on the corner is the Massey School. It's still owned by the Board of Education today. They run it as a museum. Have some interesting things to see in there, including a room set up as an old-fashioned classroom. You can see what it would have been like to go to school here back in the 1800s. The Calhoun Square is a good setting for it. One of our very few, they call intact squares, meaning there are no modern buildings here. All of these are the original buildings built here back in the 1800s. And up around this corner, also from midnight, the Garden of Good and Evil, we have Carys Restaurant around here. Appeared in the book and the movie. Carys started out as a drugstore years and years ago. And today it's strictly a restaurant for breakfast or lunch. But it was at Carys over here where Lutheran Burgers used to hang out, replacing the entire water supply for the city. Well, this is Carys here, another good place to eat. Next to Carys, once again, we have Jones Street, the most beautiful street in the South, according to Southern Living magazine. And this next square honors the Marquis de Lafayette, French nobleman fought alongside the Americans during the Revolutionary War. And Lafayette Square has a really nice place to stay. Over here to the right is the Hamilton Turner Inn. Big fancy building on the corner over here was built in 1873. And it would be the first place around here to have electric lighting. Samuel Hamilton wired his front parlors over here in 1883. And that night, a huge crowd gathered out front. Everyone wanted to see the lights turn on for the first time. Apparently, everyone was expecting the house to blow up or catch on fire, which fortunately didn't happen. So today, it's a really nice place to stay. And then up ahead of us, this is by far our biggest church, the Catholic Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. Finished in the 1890s. This, at the moment, I believe is the only church you can go in if they're not doing services here. They hold Mass here at noon every day. The rest of the time, it's usually open to the public. You can go inside and look around. Very impressive building. A lot of marble, a lot of Austrian stained glass in there. This is also one of our shuttle stops here as well. But that's the Catholic Cathedral, St. John the Baptist. Originally, when Georgia started, though Catholics weren't allowed here. This was an English colony, a Protestant nation. Again, Spain was right down the road in Florida. Spanish infiltrating their new colony. cemetery up here. Opened up in 1750. And they buried people over here until 1853. And they believe somewhere around 10 or 11,000 people are buried in here because of these brick buildings scattered around. These are crypts. They go underground about 10 feet or so. You look down at the bottom on the front of most of these, you'll see an arch down there. That is the very top of the original door. So if you dug down right in front of one of these, eventually you hit an old staircase that goes down to a now bricked up door. And inside there's a little room that has 3 shelves on each side and a big limestone, what you call ossuary or bone box in there. And the way those things work, someone passed away, they would wrap them up in linen, put them on the shelf. They didn't use coffins as much back then. They just wrapped you up in linen, put you on the shelf, and it was sort of a way of recycling too, you might say. See, when things filled up, they moved the old bones to the bone box, and then you had a free shelf for any recently departed. Sort of a grim practice, although some people, they say it's romantic. Keeps a family together for all eternity. Whether they really want to be or not, I guess. So when we turn here, you'll see a monument with 4 great columns. This is the grave of Button Gwinnett. He's one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence from the state of Georgia. He's buried right over here. Now, very not too far away from him is a guy named Lackland McIntosh. McIntosh is the guy that shot and killed Button Gwinnett. They fought a duel here in Savannah. They were political rivals, and both of them were shot. McIntosh recovered. Button Gwinnett died of his wounds a few days later, but they're both buried here in Colonial Park. And today we have McIntosh County just to the south of us, and Gwinnett County's up in North Georgia, but now they're also named for those two. Well, that's Colonial Park Cemetery, the second burial ground used here. And from here we're going to head over to the east side of the city. And this side of Savannah is a little different. Big fires that hit the city over the years did a lot of damage, but they didn't hit this side of Savannah as much for some reason. So you'll find quite a few of the older buildings are still over here. Wooden buildings from the late 17 and early 1800s. But up ahead here we have Columbia Square. And if you're interested in military history, around the corner over here, they opened the Webb Military Museum a few years ago. And they've got a lot of interesting things, artifacts. Pretty much every war the U.S. has been in, from the early days, the Indian Wars, the Civil War, up through the modern conflicts going on. So over here to the right is the Webb Military Museum. They're also worth a visit while you're here. That's the Webb Museum, also over here on this side of Savannah. The very northeast corner over here is the Pirate's House, as it's known today. Pirate's House is another good place to eat. They've turned it into a very good restaurant. Pirate's House is also the oldest building in the state of Georgia. They dated it 1754, and it's called the Pirate's House today because years ago it was a tavern and a boarding house for sailors coming into the port, and apparently it was not the nicest of places to stay. It was to hang out of pirates and smugglers, and for years they had a tunnel that ran underground from the rum cellar down to the river, and they used this tunnel for smuggling. They would bring rum in from the Caribbean. One of the main prohibitions when Georgia started, there was no hard alcohol allowed here, so they would smuggle in rum from the Caribbean. also used this tunnel for exporting of a sort, what they call Shanghai. See, you need another sailor for your next voyage, so you'll find some unsuspecting guy and buy him a drink with a little something extra added to it when he passes out to take him down through the tunnel. And the next thing he knows, he's waking up on board a ship. He's miles out to sea and has a brand new career. He's on his way to Shanghai or Hong Kong, the Caribbean, wherever. It usually take him years to get back here to Savannah. The Pirate's House up here, they also take good for being inspiration for the Admiral Benbow. You've read the novel Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevens. The Admiral Benbow Inn is where the story starts out. And we know Robert Louis Stevenson traveled through this area and visited the building over here. No doubt he heard all the stories and legends that surround it. So they take credit for inspiring the story and being the model for the Admiral Benbow Inn. So right around the corner here's the Pirate's House. Another good place to eat. They also tell me Captain Flint's still roaming around in there. You might run into him if you visit the Pirate's House. So this green building up ahead here is their banquet area. The main restaurant is the gray building over to the left. That's the Pirate's House. Another good place to eat. Pirate's House, also one of our shelter stops too, if you'd like to come back and visit this area. This is the Pirate's House, also the oldest building in the state of Georgia, right here, the gray building. That's the Pirate's House, and over up ahead here is one of our smaller squares. They tend to get smaller as you go towards the edge of the historic district. This is Washington Square up ahead of us here. And around it you see some of the older buildings I mentioned, wooden buildings from the late 17 and early 1800s. And this side of Savannah's a little more residential too. Has a different feel to it. A bit like stepping back in time to some degree. But up here on the right is a group they call the Rainbow Row. It's a little later, 1890s. But really bright, vibrant Mediterranean colors, very popular in this area in the 19th century. So something like this you definitely could have seen here in Savannah, middle to late 1800s. Now also, as you're roaming around Savannah, you'll notice some of our streets and a bunch of sidewalks, like this one to the right here, they have shells in them. They have oyster shells in them. These are made out of what they call tabby, kind of concrete. They would mix sand, lime, water, and oyster shells. Make the kind of concrete they call tabby. And they use this a lot, especially on the islands, off the Carolinas, Georgia, down through Florida. But you'll find tabby here in Savannah. We have some streets and a bunch of sidewalks made out of tabby. And we'll also go by the Owens House Museum here in a minute. That, I believe, is the only building we have in Savannah made out of tabby. But if you go right outside Savannah to the south of us to the Isle of Hope, you'll find the tabby ruins of Wormslow Plantation out there. And Wormslow dates from about 1740. It's just old tabby ruins out there today. But Wormslow's the closest thing to a plantation we have left right around Savannah. stores and restaurants. Broughton Street, here's worth strolling down. And our next house museum is coming up on the right up here. The Isaiah Davenport house was built in 1820. And it was the beginning of the historic preservation movement here. This brick building on the corner, they were going to tear this down in the 1950s. And a group of 7 women got together. They raised about $20,000, bought the building and started restoring it. Today the Davenport house has been returned to the 1820s, and they do tours here. They're celebrating their 200th birthday this year. But they do tours there, have some interesting things in there, including some period brick wallpaper they've put on the walls, which will really make your head spin. They used some interesting patterns back in the 19th century. Well, that's the Isaiah Davenport house. And around this corner is another really nice place to stay and another really good place to eat. I'll roll into one. This green building up here is the 1790. Very good bed and breakfast upstairs and a very good restaurant on the first floor. These guys only open up for dinner, but it's another good place to eat. And across the street here is the Owens Thomas house, built in 1819. Building in back here originally was the slave quarters on the right and the carriage house on the left. They have some of the best preserved urban slave quarters in the United States here at the Owens Thomas house. But the main building up ahead here was designed by a young English architect named William J. And he did a number of buildings around Savannah, put a lot of interesting features in his buildings. The Owens Thomas house here was one of the first buildings in the country to have running water. It was designed with a system of cisterns. The roof collected rainwater channeled into the cisterns. So this house had running water, flushing toilets, a shower, bathtubs more than 15 years before the White House or Buckingham Palace had running water. There's a lot of interesting things in this house. A lot of these house museums, you'll see a lot of faux finishing. You'll see wooden columns painted to look like marble, pine doors painted to look like mahogany. But they've got a lot of interesting features. William J. was also into curved walls and round rooms, and he did a good bit of that here at the Owens Thomas house as well. But square next to us here honors our city's founder, General James Oglethorpe. But you'll remember we met him a little while ago over in Chippewa Square. The statue of James Oglethorpe's over there. Another curiosity of Savannah, the statues and the monuments we have here, they don't match up with the squares. So the statue of James Oglethorpe's not there in Oglethorpe Square, it's in Chippewa Square. Monument to General Nathaniel Greene, it's not in Green Square, it's in Johnson Square. And the monument to Count Casimir Pulaski is not in Pulaski Square, it's in Monterey. Why, I have no idea. I've asked a lot of people about this, and so far no one's been able to figure out a reason. But for some reason, the statues and the monuments we have here, they don't match up with the squares. But the next square up here is one of the oldest squares. Wright Square was one of the 4 original squares built here. Named for James Wright today, the last royal governor of the colony of Georgia. But once upon a time, as they say, this square had a much more sinister name. See, it was known as the Hanging Square. Because over to the left, about where the one-way sign is today, is where the gallows stood, where they hanged people. So years ago, this was Savannah's hanging square. And we're back to the center of town. This is Bull Street, center of the historic district. And also back to Broughton Street. Now if you go down Broughton Street, to the right, about 4 or 5 blocks, you'll find Leopold's Ice Cream down there. They're also worth a visit. They make their own ice cream down there at Leopold's. In fact, Leopold's is where the flavor Tutti Frutti was invented. But up ahead here is where Savannah started, Johnson Square ahead of us. Very first square built here. It's the largest square, and it has the first monument built here in the center square. Is a monument to General Nathaniel Greene, another Revolutionary War hero. And around the corner over here is Christ Church. This building with the green doors ahead of us is Christ Episcopal Church. Call it the Mother Church of Georgia. This is the original congregation started by the colonists when they landed here in 1733. Not their original building, though. This building dates from the 1840s. But some of our local celebrities have been members of this congregation. Juliet Gordon Lowe, founder of the Girl Scouts, was baptized here. She was married here. Later they would hold her funeral at Christ Church. And up ahead here is Reynolds Square. It's what you might call a 2G square, second generation square. One of the first expansions of the city. But another curiosity of Savannah. All around this area we have Spanish moss growing. It grows all over the place, except in about 4 or 5 of our squares. If you look at Reynolds Square here, look all around, there's no Spanish moss. And nobody can figure out why. The ghost hunters, they love to tell people Spanish moss won't grow, where something tragic occurred, where spirits linger. But so far I haven't found anything all that tragic that ever occurred in Reynolds Square. It's an interesting idea, I guess. But we have 22 squares here in Savannah. They all have Spanish moss except for about 4 or 5. And nobody can figure out why. But also to the left over there is the old Pink House. That pink building over there was built in 1789 as the Haberton family home, and it's been turned into a good restaurant. And another interesting building, one of the few 18th century buildings we still have here in Savannah, and it's still set up very much the way it was when it was the Haberton family home. So you can have dinner in the dining room, the front parlor, the bedroom. It's still set up more or less the way it was when it was the Haberton family home. And this is Bay Street ahead of us here. Last street before you go down to River Street. And that's where we're heading next. There's a lot to see and do down on River Street. It's a good place to get a bite to eat and watch the huge container ships go down the river. We have one of the busiest ports in the United States here in Savannah. And it's always an impressive sight. Watch those massive container ships go down the river. But to get there, we have to go down the ramp. And it's going to be a little bit of a bumpy ride for the next few minutes. You'll notice all these stones they used to pave the ramp. A lot of people call these cobblestones. They're also known as ballast stones. They were used as ballast on the ships coming over from England. A lot of ships left England without any cargo, and they used the stones to weight the ships or ballast the ships. They got here in Savannah, they didn't need them anymore. They took them out, threw them to the side, loaded the boat up, and over time these stones collected in big piles along River Street. And since there's no natural stone around this area, they started putting these to use. They used them to pave the roads and build some of these buildings. You can see the old back wall to the right there, this back wall over here to the left. They used them to build some of these old warehouses. A lot of these, the bottom floors are older than the top floors. They were added onto as time went on. But the old cotton warehouses, they call them cotton warehouses. And cotton was king here for a long time, but they shipped a lot of things out of the port of Savannah. Rice was a huge crop here. We had a lot of rice plantations along the Savannah River. And lumber was a big industry, still is today. They do a lot of indigo here. Savannah's always been a busy port city. River Street, it's always been a busy place. This was a busy port for a long time. They moved the modern port up the river to the left. It's up there past the Talmadge Bridge. That great big bridge is the Talmadge Bridge. Take you from here in Savannah across the river to Hutchinson Island, and then over to South Carolina on the other side of that. Next to us is the Savannah River, and that's where the city got its name. The river was named long before the city was built here. And the Savannah River's the border between Georgia and South Carolina. However, across from us over there is Hutchinson Island. It's still a part of the state of Georgia. South Carolina's on the other side of that. And over there you have the Savannah Convention Center on the left. The taller building on the right is the Westin Hotel. And it's another nice place to stay. In fact, Robert Redford has stayed there a couple of times. And he was filming movies around this area. But the other side, the old warehouses, most of these date 1830s, 40s. Some do go back to the late 1700s. And the bottom floors here along River Street this was warehouse space originally. They would store cotton and other merchandise here before it shipped out of the port. And the upper floors were offices for the cotton factors or cotton brokers. Now the last cotton office on River Street, it closed in 1956. So today, all these buildings are stores, restaurants, art galleries. There's a couple nice places to stay on River Street. But another fun thing to do on River Street, take a riverboat cruise. Coming up on the left up here, you'll see the Savannah River Queen. It's the smaller of our two riverboats. We also have the Georgia Queen, one of the biggest riverboats in the country. And it's usually down at the other end of River Street. But they do about an hour and a half tour down the Savannah River and back. We're about 15 miles from the Atlantic Ocean here in Savannah, and they don't go quite that far. But they also do a dinner cruise, a Sunday brunch cruise. They used to do a whole bunch of them. I'm not sure exactly how many that come back, but the normal cruise is about an hour and a half down the Savannah River and then back here. Well, getting to the end of River Street, coming Coming up on the left up here's an interesting monument. You see the statue of a girl waving a towel. It's the monument to Florence Marta. She was known as the Waving Girl of Savannah. And the guy that designed this monument, his name was Felix de Weldon. He would also do the Iwo Jima Monument, the Marine War Memorial, and the Seabees Memorial up in Virginia. And this was Florence Marta's. As the story goes, she lived on Elba Island at the mouth of the Savannah River with her brother, the lighthouse keeper, and she fell in love with a sailor as a young woman. He sailed away on a voyage, promising to come back to her. So she greeted all the ships that came in, wanted to make sure he knew where to find her when he returned. Unfortunately, her sailor never did make it back here to Savannah. But for years and years, she greeted all the ships coming in, waving a kerchief during the day and a lantern at night. So that was Florence Marta, known as the Waving Girl of Savannah. And back up here on the bluff, this area up here originally was the trustees' garden. They had kind of an experimental gardening up here, you might say. Trying to figure out what would grow around this area. One of the first things they bought here was mulberry trees and silkworms. They really wanted to build a silk industry here in the New Colony. And they bought mulberry trees and silkworms. Unfortunately, the climate didn't cooperate with them. The silkworms don't like a climate here in South Georgia. So after a couple years of trying, they gave up on that. But the peaches Georgia's famous for were started here, peanuts, wine grapes. And today we have Davenport Park to the right of us. It has a number of monuments. First one is to the Chatham Artillery, military unit formed during the Revolutionary War. They're still an active unit, the Georgia National Guard, the 118th Field Artillery. That's now on the list. And we have our Vietnam Memorial. Celtic Cross up here is made out of Irish rings. Celtic Cross is going to be part of our St. Patrick's celebrations every year. And then we have our Koreatown Memorial. That's always been a very busy port city. Today, we are the fourth busiest port in the U.S. We got Los Angeles, Long Beach, New York, and then Savannah's number 4. But it was really the years leading up to the Civil War, the 1830s, 40s, 50s. These were some of the most prosperous years for Savannah. They were shipping millions of dollars of cotton out of the port. That's when a lot of the big fancy homes and buildings were built. There wasn't a lot of cotton hanging around this area. A lot of the bigger, fancier homes around here were built. But coming up on the right up there, mostly George and Martha. These two cannons over here are Washington guns. They were brought here in 1791. General George Washington presented these to the Chatham Artillery in recognition of their service during the Revolutionary War. So that's George and Martha, our two Washington guns. To the left is our United States Custom House. Built in the 1850s, the most impressive feature has to be those solid columns. Out they're solid from top to bottom. And they carved those up in Massachusetts, brought them to Savannah strapped to the decks of ships. They estimate each one weighs somewhere around 15 tons. Took them over a month to get each one from the river up on the Bay Street is Savannah. And on the right over here is our Hyatt Hotel. It's another nice place to stay. And if you're thinking of going down the River Street, but you don't really like the idea of walking down the ramp or possibly facing the stone stairs of death as they have become known, Hyatt has an option for you. They have an elevator that goes down the River Street. Probably the quickest, easiest, and safest way to get from Bay Street down to River Street and then back up again. But from here we're heading to the city market on the west side of the historic district over here. It's a collection of shops and stores and restaurants. It's called the city market, and it's always been a commercial center going back to the 1700s. Farmers would bring their produce there to sell. Fishermen, tradesmen would bring things to sell. But today it's called the city market, and it's still kind of a commercial center. A lot of shops and stores in there. And Franklin Square, this next square we'll see in a minute, is also one of our smaller squares. But in the center you'll see the monument to the Haitian soldiers that fought here during the Revolutionary War in October of 1779. The British had occupied the city of Savannah for about a year or so. British and Americans were really badly. It's not a good day. They got called the second bloodiest battle of the Revolutionary War. But fighting alongside the French and Americans that day were a group of soldiers from Haiti, a French colony at the time. So they erected a monument to these fellows over here in Franklin Square a few years ago. And on the left side of the monument, little drummer boy, he would turn out to be the most significant member of the group. His name was Henri Christophe. He would fight here in the American Revolution, returned to Haiti, fought in their revolution, and he ultimately wound up as the king of Haiti. So this is their monument at the head of us. And to the right over here is the First African Baptist Church. This building built back in the 1850s. In the sanctuary they have holes in the floor, kind of like a decorative pattern. Those in fact were air holes originally. This building over here was a stop along the route of the Underground Railroad for slaves escaping north. And the holes they have in the floor originally served as air holes for slaves staying there before they could make their way north. There's some things to see and do in City Market. That gray building with the green awning to the left there is a Vinnie Van Gogh's really good pizza place. And if you have a sweet tooth right next to Vinnie's, you'll find the Savannah Candy Kitchen, that green awning over there. And we have Belford's on this corner, good place for steak or seafood. It's Belford's on the right is Garibaldi's, another good seafood place. Also Molly McPherson's, this blue building's a really good Scottish pub. Also quite a few art galleries scattered around in here. Some of our local artists have studios in this area. There's quite a few art galleries scattered around in here. And another place you'll want to visit is up here on the left. This red awning is the Bird's Cookie Company. Also worth visit. They've been baking memories since 1924 here with the Bird's Company. Ellis Square out here is kind of our more modern square, you might say. It has more modern amenities. They have the information office down there to the left. You say hello to Johnny Mercer. He's over there leaning against the fire plug. Ellis Square here is kind of our more modern square. And around the corner over here, we're back to Broadway Street. And also up ahead here is Telfair Square. We went by the Telfair Hospital a little bit ago. Telfair families, very prominent family in the early days of Georgia. Edward Telfair came here, made a ton of money in the import-export business. And the Telfair Mansion was built by his son in 1818. Later married Telfair. We'll leave it to the Georgia Historical Society. They turned it into the Telfair Academy of Arts and Sciences. That opened up in 1886. So today, this big yellow building coming up around the corner here is the oldest museum in the South. And in there, you'll find a lot of American Impressionist art. Also, that's where you'll find the Bird Girl statue from the cover of the book Midnight, the Garden of Good and Evil. Little Wendy's on display here in the Telfair. So this is the Telfair Academy of Arts and Sciences today. And this also brings us almost to the end of our tour, but from here, where's everybody going?